This is a $13 billion floating city with its own power plant, hospital, airport, and thousands of residents, and it sails into war. For the next few seconds, forget that it's a ship. Think of it as a skyscraper laid on its side, longer than 3 football fields, taller than a 15-story building, made entirely of steel, and moving at highway speeds over black water. On its roof, jets slam down and leap into the air. Beneath that, people are sleeping, eating, repairing machines, doing laundry, writing emails home. All of it stacked in metal boxes, bolted together, riding the waves. This is the first episode of Inside the Carrier, and we're stepping aboard the U.S. Navy's Ford-class aircraft carrier, the most complex moving object humans have ever built. From a distance, it looks like one solid chunk of gray metal. Up close, the numbers start to break your brain. Over 1,000 feet from bow to stern, dozens of compartments stacked from the flight deck down to the keel. A crew of around 4,500 people when the air wing is aboard enough to fill a small town. Every single day, this one ship burns through mountains of supplies. Tens of thousands of meals cooked and served around the clock. Fresh water constantly made from seawater for drinking, showers, and machines. Fuel for jets, fuel for small boats, spare parts for everything from radar consoles to coffee machines. And the waste has to go somewhere too. Trash compacted, ground, or burned. Dirty water collected, treated, and pushed back out within strict limits. Keeping the city alive at sea can cost millions of dollars a day, and yet, out here, there's no backup city next door if something breaks. Everything has to work, all at once, all the time. By the time you finish this episode, these numbers won't be abstractions anymore. You'll know exactly where they live and who keeps them under control. Right now, you're only seeing the outside, the noise, the motion, the scale. But inside this steel shell, there are dozens of hidden worlds stacked on top of each other. In one dark room, sailors stare at glowing screens, tracking unknown dots in the sky, and on the sea, the carrier's Combat Information Center, where decisions in seconds can change the course of a battle. Deep below the waterline, behind thick doors and security checks, the reactor spaces hum with controlled power, nuclear energy quietly driving the entire city forward. Far forward and far below, in armored rooms called magazines, rows of bombs and missiles wait in spotless racks, inches apart, handled with a mix of routine and absolute fear of a mistake. One deck up, a narrow compartment holds triple-stacked bunks where 6, 9, sometimes more sailors share a room the size of a small bedroom. Around the corner, cramped showers and a constantly busy laundry fight, a losing battle against sweat, salt, and time. On another deck, a doctor leans over an operating table in a fully equipped shipboard hospital with x-rays, lab tests, and even dental chairs because when you're a week from land, this is your only ER. Every room you're seeing now, from that tiny bunk to that hidden control room, will get its own episode. But to understand any of them, we first have to see how they all fit together into one living, breathing city at sea. That's where we're heading next. We've seen the flight deck, the jets, the ocean scale. Now, let's start with a map. If you sliced a Ford-class carrier open like a giant steel cake, this is what you'd see. Not one ship, but layers of a city, stacked vertically, each one with its own purpose, rules, and rhythm. At the very top is the part everyone recognizes, the runway. But the magic of an aircraft carrier isn't the roof. It's everything beneath it. The living spaces, the workshops, the storage, the command rooms, and the power that keeps all of it moving. Think of this the way you'd think of a busy airport terminal built on top of a factory, built on top of a power plant, built on top of a small town. That's a Ford-class carrier. By the end of this chapter, you won't just know the names of these decks, you'll know why each one has to exist for the whole city to survive at sea. Start at the roof. The flight deck is the carrier's public face, an airport compressed into a rectangle of steel, where every second is timed, every movement choreographed. You'll see colored jerseys moving like traffic lights. Some guiding aircraft, some fueling, some handling weapons, others coordinating launches and recoveries. This is where the city announces itself to the world. The noise is constant, the wind is brutal, and the margin for error is almost insulting in how small it is. But here's the first big mental shift. The flight deck isn't the carrier's whole identity. It's the surface of a system. Because the moment a jet lands, the real work often begins one deck below. So let's go down. Directly under the flight deck sits the hangar deck, the carrier's industrial heart for aviation. If the roof is the airport, this is the maintenance garage and assembly floor. Here, aircraft are parked, inspected, refueled, armed, repaired, and moved with a precision that looks casual only because it's practiced 1,000 times. This is also where you feel the scale of a floating city in a different way. The hangar is huge, but it never feels empty. There are always people pushing equipment, checking panels, moving parts, solving problems that have to be fixed before the next launch window. And just beyond the hangar, deeper into the ship, the carrier becomes more domestic, more human. Because around these industrial spaces, thousands of sailors are living their daily lives, stacked in tight geometry of bunks, passageways, and routines. So the next layer is where the city starts to feel like a city of people, not just machines. Below the hangar, the carrier becomes a maze of working districts and residential blocks. This is where you'll find the berthing spaces, compact rooms built for function, not comfort. Rows of bunks, narrow aisles, lockers filled with everything a sailor can fit into a life measured in months at sea. Nearby are the galleys, the ship's kitchens, because a city this big runs on calories and discipline. A Ford class doesn't just feed people. It feeds a workforce that has to perform in heat, noise, and exhaustion without losing precision. Then there's the ship's hospital, a reminder that when you carry thousands of people into dangerous environments, you need more than band-aids. You need the ability to treat injuries, illness, and emergencies far from land. And deeper still, the tone changes again. This is where the carrier hides its most sensitive organs. Magazines where weapons are stored with obsessive safety. Damage control hubs that train for fire and flooding as if it's a daily weather forecast. And the engineering spaces that keep the city alive when nobody is watching. And somewhere in this layered machine is a dark, quiet room full of screens, the Combat Information Center, where the enormous carrier shrinks into dots and tracks and decisions measured in seconds. Here's the truly strange part. Right below where jets slam onto the deck at high speed, sailors are sleeping, eating, and working next to rooms full of bombs and nuclear power. And yet, most of the time, it feels normal. That's the psychology of a floating city. Everything dangerous becomes routine, because routine is how you survive. Now that you can picture the map, we can start exploring each district in detail. Next, we're going into some of the smallest rooms on this giant ship, the spaces that control launches and landings with almost ridiculous responsibility. We've mapped the decks. Now, let's watch the city breathe. In the first chapter, we built a mental map of the Ford-class carrier as a vertical city of steel. This chapter is the next step: time. To really feel this ship, let's compress 24 hours on a Ford-class carrier into a few minutes. And imagine a simple timeline sliding from 0 to 24 to 0 as the city shifts from quiet to roar and back again. This isn't a perfect clock of every deployment. It's a representative day, an average that hides thousands of small differences. But it captures the truth of life on the carrier. Everything is synchronized to keep the roof flying. The day on a carrier doesn't begin with sunrise, it begins with a schedule. Somewhere deep inside the hull, an alarm buzzes in a berthing space where the air smells faintly of detergent and steel. A sailor swings down from a top rack, careful not to wake the person below. In another compartment, someone already has boots on, coffee in hand, heading toward a narrow passageway lit by soft, sleepy lighting. Within minutes, the ship's internal rhythm kicks on. In the galleys, culinary specialists are warming ovens, loading trays, and working through breakfast for thousands of people in rotating waves. You don't feed a floating city in one sitting. You feed it in shifts, time to watch rotations and flight schedules. The sounds are familiar and industrial. A clatter of pans, a hiss of steam, the low hum of ventilation fighting the heat. In small offices and storerooms, supply teams check inventories, track incoming requests, and stage parts that will be needed before anyone can even say launch. On a Ford-class carrier, a missing valve, a broken headset, or a depleted sealant tube can become a flight delay before lunch. Morning muster happens in compact spaces. A chief gives a crisp update, a division checks names, a junior sailor listens to a list of tasks that will shape the next 12 hours. The brief is short. The expectations are not. Because on this ship, workday is a misleading word. The carrier doesn't operate like an office. It operates like a factory that happens to be moving through contested oceans. The timeline marker slides toward late morning. And as the first waves of crew finish breakfast, another world starts to wake up above them, the one that makes this entire city exist. By late morning, the flight deck is alive in full-color choreography. Yellow shirts guide jets like ground marshals at a civilian airport. Purple shirts manage fuel. Red shirts handle ordnance. Green shirts keep the machines and catapults breathing. Blue shirts move aircraft and equipment through lanes that look generous from a drone shot and impossibly narrow when you're standing inside them. From the outside, it looks like controlled chaos. From the inside, it's closer to ballet with consequences. A launch cycle begins long before a jet touches a catapult. It starts in briefing rooms where pilots review weather, targets, and fuel plans. It continues in the hangar where maintenance checks are finished under hard white lights. And then it reaches the deck through elevators, tow bars, and carefully timed hand signals. One crew is arming a jet with a methodical calm. Another is topping off fuel measured in thousands of pounds. A third is doing a final walk-around that is equal parts checklist and instinct. In the ready rooms, a last-minute update can rewrite a plan that looked perfect an hour ago. High above the deck, in the tower, the air boss and mini boss watch the chaos like traffic controllers for a city-sized airport, calling the rhythm of launches and recoveries. Most viewers never see this layer of command, but it's one more reminder that even the loudest moments are guided by quiet, disciplined decision-making. What makes this feel like a city isn't just the noise, it's the coordination. Hundreds of people doing different jobs at different speeds for one goal: keep the launch window alive. Down in the Combat Information Center, operators watch the sky transform into tracks and numbers. Radar returns, data links, threat rings. The deck above might be roaring, but in the CIC, the soundscape is quieter headsets, calm voices, quick confirmations. And far below that, engineering teams manage the load. When the flight schedule peaks, the ship's demand for power peaks with it. A Ford-class carrier doesn't just launch aircraft. It routes energy, cooling, air, and communications so that the roof can function as an airport in the middle of nowhere. After a recovery, sailors peel off gear, rinse salt, and sweat in cramped showers, and head back to the next task. Nobody on this ship is watching only one clock. The flight deck is the loudest district of the city. But the city is bigger than its roof. And as jets cycle above, the hangar deck becomes the bridge between spectacle and survival. When the most dramatic part of the day slows, the carrier doesn't relax. It resets. Afternoon is when the ship looks most like an industrial campus. Jets that just flew are inspected. Fluids are sampled. Tires, brakes, avionics, and hydraulic lines are checked with practiced urgency. The hangar deck is busy, but not frantic. The goal is simple: turn wear into readiness before the next window opens. Repair teams move through workshops that feel like small businesses inside a megastructure. A machinist cuts a part to spec. An avionics tech troubleshoots a fault that won't show up cleanly on a checklist. A structural mechanic checks skins and fasteners with the patience of someone who knows that tiny cracks can become huge problems. Tool control counts every item going in and out because a single missing wrench can become a lethal piece of debris on the flight deck. On a Ford-class carrier, cleaning is also a form of readiness. Deck crews repaint worn markings. Teams reset tie-down points. Carts are reorganized. Safety checks happen at a pace that looks obsessive until you realize what a single misstep costs in time, money, or lives. Away from the aviation spaces, the city services are also catching up. Laundry runs in heavy cycles. Galley crews restock and prep for the next meal wave. Supply leaders update the quiet math of consumption versus inventory. A city that moves cannot afford to be surprised by something as simple as missing detergent or fresh produce. Elsewhere, the city performs maintenance on itself. Damage control teams run drills that are equal parts training and ritual. Firefighting gear is checked. Hoses are laid out and rolled back up. Watertight doors are tested. Communication chains are rehearsed. The ocean is neutral until it isn't, and a carrier survives by assuming the next emergency is always possible. By early evening, the energy shifts to morale. The ship's store opens. The gym fills. A barbershop line forms. Someone finds a quiet corner to call home. A group watches a game on a small screen that feels absurdly normal given the steel and weapons surrounding them. This is how a floating city stays human. Not by pretending it's easy, but by building small routines that keep people steady inside a machine that never fully stops. Because when night arrives, the work doesn't end. It changes hands. Night operations are where the carrier feels most like a secret. The ocean turns black. The wind grows colder. The flight deck lights carve narrow cones through mist and spray. A jet lands hard. A few seconds of violence, followed by the soft rush of people resetting the deck for the next aircraft. Below, night shift mechanics work under fluorescent light that never changes its mood. In the galley, smaller crews prepare late meals for those who just came off watch. In the CIC, the screens don't care what time it is. Neither do the engineering teams monitoring power, cooling, and the endless loops of systems that keep the city breathable. The carrier is a stack of responsibilities, and at night you can almost hear the handoff between shifts, the quiet competence of people who know that tiredness is not an excuse here. Somewhere in berthing, sailors finally fall asleep to the familiar soundtrack of ventilation and distant machinery. Others are wide awake on watch, looking out over an empty horizon. A boatswain's mate checks a line. A junior officer reviews tomorrow's plan. A corpsman restocks supplies that might be needed before dawn. Someone in a small office sorts late mail and updates paperwork that will never make the highlight reel, but still keeps the machine legal, safe, and accountable. The timeline marker reaches the last hours of the day. And this is where the city feels its most fragile and its most disciplined at the same time. What you're seeing now is just one day. This goes on for months at a time, often far from land, often with no lights on the horizon at all. So, how does this city not fall apart? That question is the doorway to the carrier's hidden systems, the power, water, supply chains, and safety culture that make the impossible feel routine. And that's where we're going next. We've seen the decks. We've watched the carrier breathe through a day. Now we go beneath the obvious and into the systems that keep the city alive. Because a Ford-class aircraft carrier is not just a runway at sea. It's a self-contained world that must generate its own power, stretch its own water supply, feed thousands of people, and manage the mess they leave behind week after week, often far from land. Start with the most invisible miracle of all, energy. A Ford-class carrier has 2 nuclear power plants inside its hull. That sentence sounds simple. The reality is anything but. Inside these spaces, the carrier becomes what it truly is, a floating industrial ecosystem. Nuclear heat becomes steam. Steam becomes motion. Motion becomes electricity. And electricity becomes everything you recognize up top: radar, communications, climate control, lighting, elevators, and the systems that launch aircraft. Like a heartbeat in metal, when flight operations peak, the demand surges. Jets need fuel and ordnance. Yes, but the ship also needs the electrical muscle to power the sensors that protect them, the networks that coordinate them, the cooling that keeps electronics stable, and the countless small devices that stop being small the moment they fail. And what makes the Ford class distinct is that it was built for the present and the next few decades, not just the last. More electric demand, more automation, more systems competing for stable power. The carrier doesn't just move through the ocean, it moves power through itself like a city routing electricity during a heat wave. Some of this work is loud machinery, turbines, the constant vibration of a ship that never fully rests. Most of it is quiet. Watchstanders staring at panels, listening to the ship's pulse, adjusting the load before anyone on the flight deck ever feels a flicker. We'll go inside the nuclear heart in a dedicated episode, but for now, just remember, these rooms can never, ever go dark. Because if the power fails, the airport on the roof becomes a parking lot, and the city beneath it stops being a city. So energy is the first promise a carrier makes to itself, but power alone doesn't keep humans alive. Water does. A carrier is a city surrounded by water, and that might be the most misleading comfort on Earth. Because salt water is everywhere and usable water is rare. On a Ford-class carrier, fresh water isn't a luxury. It's a production line. The ship has to make its own water, filter it, store it, and distribute it through a maze of pipes that snakes through steel like arteries in a massive organism. That water supports everything: drinking, cooking, showers, laundry, medical care, cleaning, and the mechanical needs of the ship itself. Think about the scale for a second. Thousands of people, multiple meals per day, heat, sweat, aviation fuel, and the relentless salt air. Even if everyone is careful, the daily demand is enormous. So the carrier turns the ocean into a resource. Water is processed and purified. Air is conditioned and circulated. Temperature is managed across spaces that range from the scorching flight deck to chilled electronics rooms that must not overheat. This is the part of the ship that almost never gets cinematic attention. There's no jet blast here. No dramatic arresting wire snap. No camera-ready salute. But these systems are the quiet hand that keeps people functional. They keep the bunks livable, the kitchens safe, the hospital sterile, the gear clean enough to do another shift. And on a long deployment, small failures compound. A clogged filter, a pump that loses efficiency, a leak that seems minor until someone notices the humidity curve rising across a compartment. So the city's utilities teams work in a world of routine that looks boring only until you imagine the alternative. Because if the carrier can't control water and air, the city doesn't just become uncomfortable, it becomes uninhabitable. Power keeps the lights on, water and air keep the people standing. But a city can survive thirst longer than it can survive hunger. So let's follow the supply chain that turns steel into daily life. Feeding a Ford-class carrier is not a kitchen problem. It's a logistics problem disguised as a kitchen. Because this city doesn't shop, it doesn't have delivery apps, and it can't simply run out for supplies. Instead, it relies on an engineered chain of movement. The story begins far from the carrier itself, with the supply ships that bring fuel, food, spare parts, mail, and everything that turns a warship into a livable world. At sea, replenishment isn't a nice-to-have. It's a lifeline. Pallets move across transfer lines. Cargo is staged, counted, and rushed below decks. Cold storage areas swallow mountains of meat, vegetables, and long-life staples. Dry goods are stacked with the precision of a warehouse built inside a moving building. Then the city services take over. The galleys are industrial kitchens designed to feed thousands efficiently without wasting time or space. Breakfast waves, lunch waves, dinner waves, each one timed around flight schedules, watch rotations, and the reality that someone is always working somewhere on the ship. This is where the carrier feels most like a real city, because food is culture. It's mood. It's a brief moment of normality in a life engineered for readiness. But every tray tells a deeper story. A simple meal represents a chain of planning, weight limits, storage constraints, nutrition requirements, and the unglamorous math that determines how long a city can remain at sea without degrading performance. On land, we take abundance for granted. At sea, abundance is designed. And this is also why supply officers and logistics specialists matter as much as any visible combat role. Because on a carrier, morale and readiness can be separated by something as plain as coffee, fresh fruit, or a reliable flow of replacement parts for the machines that keep aircraft flying. We'll dive into the kitchens and the supply world in their own episode. For now, just hold on to the idea that the Ford-class carrier is a city whose lifeblood arrives on pallets and is transformed into stability, one meal, one shift, one day at a time. But every city that eats has to deal with what comes next: waste. A floating city doesn't get to pretend it's clean. It has to manage the full reality of human life on steel, in motion, far from shore. That means trash, wastewater, used fuel containers, food scraps, laundry cycles that never end, maintenance residue, and the thousand small byproducts of a community of thousands. On a carrier, waste management is not an afterthought, it's engineering. Some waste is compressed, some is processed, some is carefully stored until disposal is safe and allowed. Dirty water is collected and treated through systems designed to keep the ship operational and compliant. Because even in the middle of the ocean, a warship operates under rules, environmental, logistical, and tactical. This is one of the most underappreciated miracles of the carrier. Not because it's glamorous, but because it's honest. The reality of life at sea is that you can't carry an entire city without also carrying its consequences. And just like power and water, waste systems don't tolerate casual neglect. A minor failure in this layer doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks like a smell, a backlog, a clogged system. But over time, neglect becomes risk, and risk becomes downtime. So the utilities teams, engineers, and routine watch sailors handle the unglamorous work that protects the glamorous mission, because that mission is always waiting above them. So this city can feed itself, power itself, and clean up after itself thousands of people, months at sea. But there's one thing missing. Why go through all this if it never has to fight? That question is the bridge to the final chapter of this episode, the purpose of the city, the air wing, and the strike group that turns a floating metropolis into a tool of national power. Now that you've seen the invisible systems that keep the carrier alive, we can ask the bigger question: what this city is built to do when the quiet routines meet a real crisis. And that's where we're going next. We've walked the decks. We've watched the carrier breathe through a full day. We've followed the hidden systems that keep the lights on, the water flowing, and the galleys working. Now we reach the question all those systems are quietly built around. Why does a nation build a floating city so complex that it needs its own power plant, hospital, warehouses, laundries, and emergency services, then send it thousands of miles from home? Because an aircraft carrier is not the mission. It is the platform for the mission. A Ford-class carrier is a moving airbase and a command hub wrapped in steel. The runway on top is not a metaphor. It is a physical option that travels with you. That matters in a world where land bases can be too far away, politically complicated, threatened by long-range weapons, or simply unavailable when time is the enemy. So the carrier brings the runway to the problem. That is why everything you've seen matters. A cook, a mechanic, a corpsman, a radar operator, a nuclear electrician, a damage control specialist, a supply clerk. Every job exists to support one loop: launch, strike, recover, repair, and launch again. You can almost trace that loop through the ship like a map of cause and effect. A breakfast tray becomes energy for a deck crew member. A repaired pump keeps the catapult system stable. A fresh filter keeps a radar cabinet cool. A corpsman's stocked kit turns risk into confidence. A pallet transferred at sea becomes spare parts that keep aircraft on the schedule. If you want one mental image of the carrier's purpose, imagine a city whose entire economy is built around keeping an airport open during a hurricane. The airport is the reason the city exists, and the storm is the environment. The moment the carrier arrives in a region, that airport becomes a message. Not necessarily a promise of war, but a promise of capability, of speed, reach, and options. It can reassure allies, warn adversaries, and give policymakers choices before a crisis hardens into a conflict. And sometimes the message is humanitarian rather than martial. A carrier's air wing can deliver supplies, move people, and provide medical support after disasters when infrastructure ashore is broken. The same logistics that feed the city can also support civilians in need. But whether the mission is deterrence, disaster response, or combat, the logic starts here. The ship is the city. The aircraft are the point. The carrier's real combat power lives in the aircraft it carries and the people who fly and maintain them. The air wing is not a decoration for the flight deck. It is the reason the city exists. A modern carrier air wing is a balanced toolkit. Fighters provide air defense and precision strike. Electronic attack, aircraft jam, and disrupt enemy sensors. Airborne early warning pushes the group's vision far beyond the horizon. Helicopters hunt, submarines, move supplies, and rescue pilots. And support aircraft extend range, so the whole system can reach farther than the ship alone ever could. In practice, that means the air wing can shift from one mission to another with surprising speed. One day it might be flying combat air patrols to protect the group. The next, it might be supporting intelligence collection, maritime security, or deterrence flights designed to be seen. In a crisis, the same deck that launched training sorties yesterday can launch real operational missions today. From the flight deck, the wing can look like a lineup of machines. But down in the hangar and maintenance spaces, it looks like a living organism of specialists who measure time and sortie rates, maintenance turns, and safety checks. A launch cycle begins long before a jet touches a catapult. It starts in ready rooms where pilots review weather, targets, and fuel plans. It continues in the hangar where final checks are finished under hard white lights. It runs through ordnance elevators and fuel lines. And it arrives on deck through tow bars, chocks, tie-down chains, and carefully timed hand signals. One crew arms a jet with methodical calm. Another tops off fuel measured in thousands of pounds. A third performs a walk-around that is equal parts checklist and instinct. Quality assurance inspectors verified that speed never outruns safety. High above the deck, the air boss and mini boss watch the chaos, like air traffic controllers for a city-sized airport, calling the rhythm of launches and recoveries. Most viewers never see this layer of command, but it's one more reminder that even the loudest moments are guided by quiet, disciplined decision-making. And the Ford class was designed to increase this tempo. More electrical capacity, more automation, systems intended to move aircraft and weapons faster while reducing bottlenecks. You don't need to memorize the engineering to feel the strategy. The carrier is a factory whose product is air power, and the air wing is the output that turns steel into influence. When jets lift from the deck, the city has converted food, water, electricity, and human expertise into a few minutes of controlled speed and precision, far from any runway on land. That is the heartbeat you can see, and this is where the flight deck colors stop being a trivia fact and start being a system. Yellow shirts move the traffic. Purple shirts keep the fuel flowing. Red shirts handle ordnance with a calm that is earned, not assumed. Green shirts keep the catapults, arresting gear, and aircraft systems breathing. Blue shirts move aircraft and equipment through lanes that look generous from a drone shot and impossibly tight when you're standing inside them. Each color is a job. Each job is a link. And every link is there so a jet can leave the ship on time and return to a deck that is ready to catch it. But no city, even a city with an airport on its roof, operates alone. When you see a carrier on the news, it often looks like a solitary giant. In reality, it almost never sails alone. Around it is a carrier strike group, destroyers, sometimes cruisers, submarines, and logistics ships that turn one powerful city into a protected, connected force. Think of the carrier as the capital. The escorts are the city walls, the air defense grid, and the sensor network that expands awareness far beyond the carrier's own radars. Their job is to make sure the carrier can keep doing its job. A destroyer's Aegis system helps track and engage threats in the air and on the sea. These ships contribute layered air defense, missile defense, and the ability to strike at range. Under the surface, submarines add stealth, intelligence collection, and an element of uncertainty that is hard to counter and even harder to ignore. Logistics ships keep the city fed and fueled so it can remain present instead of returning home just when presence matters most. This is why the Ford class can project power for long stretches. The group distributes risk and multiplies capability. It gives the carrier depth. In a crisis, that network matters as much as the jets. The carrier is too valuable to gamble on a single layer of defense, so the strike group builds a bubble of protection air, surface, and subsurface so the air wing can focus on its mission instead of its own survival. You can think of that bubble of influence in two ways. First, as protection, the layered defenses that keep the carrier alive. Second, as reach, the space in which the air wing and the group sensors can shape events faster than anyone else in the area. And this is where the floating city metaphor becomes almost literal. A city needs police, fire services, sanitation, and utilities. A strike group needs air defense, anti-submarine warfare, cyber and electronic resilience, sea control, and replenishment. Different vocabulary, same logic. The result is an integrated system that can respond to deterrence missions, freedom of navigation operations, disaster relief, and, if ordered, combat operations with speed that land-based forces may not match. But the most important connection is still human. The strike group is not a constellation of machines. It is thousands of people across multiple hulls, synchronized by training and trust. So if the strike group is the carrier's shield, what exactly is the city preparing to do with the sword? Picture a crisis unfolding far from established airbases. The carrier is tasked to move into range. As the strike group approaches, the city's tempo changes. The air wing conducts rehearsals and final checks. Escorts spread out to create space and security. Intelligence and operations teams refine targets and assess threats. Engineers watch the load as flight operations intensify. Supply teams stage parts and munitions so that speed never becomes improvisation. Then the first launch window opens. Jets climb into the sky. Early warning aircraft extend the group's eyes. Electronic attack aircraft protect the package by blinding or confusing hostile sensors. Helicopters patrol the edges of the bubble. In the CIC, the enormous ocean shrinks into tracks and priorities. The staff builds a picture of the battle space that is constantly updated, constantly imperfect, and constantly urgent. Above them, the deck crew runs the most expensive traffic pattern on Earth. A handful of seconds at a catapult, a few minutes of taxi and staging, and suddenly the city has turned steel and nuclear heat into aircraft racing outward on mission. When the first aircraft return, the city absorbs them and immediately prepares for the next cycle. Fuel is topped off, ordnance is handled with careful speed. Maintenance teams troubleshoot faults while the aircraft is still warm. Tool control accounts for every item because the deck tolerates no loose metal. This is the carrier's advantage. Not a single dramatic strike, but the ability to sustain sorties across days and weeks, adjusting to new information without needing to relocate an airbase on land. And this is what you've been building toward across the episode. The galleys are not just feeding people, they're feeding endurance. The reactor spaces are not just making electricity, they are enabling tempo. The water systems are not just plumbing, they are keeping the workforce functional at the edge of fatigue. The hospital is not just a safety net, it is confidence that the city can keep going even when something goes wrong. So when you watch a jet launch, you are also watching the invisible work of thousands of sailors you may never see on camera. The city has done its job, the aircraft can do theirs. A Ford-class carrier is national strategy made physical, a floating city designed so that aircraft can launch, fight, and come home to a deck that is ready for them again. In the next episode, we're going into some of the smallest rooms on this giant ship, the ones where a handful of sailors launch and catch multi-million-dollar jets all day long. If they mess up, nothing else we've seen matters. We started this episode with a simple idea. A Ford-class carrier isn't just a ship. It's a moving city built around an airport. Now, as we reach the end of our first tour, that map should feel different. Because what you've really seen isn't 4 separate worlds. You've seen one machine with thousands of human hands inside it. The flight deck, the hangar, the berthing, the galleys, the engineering spaces, the medical teams, the watchstanders and dark rooms full of screens, all of it exists for a single promise. That when the moment comes, the runway on top can send aircraft into the sky and bring them home. If you slice this ship open in your mind one more time, the layers stop being abstract. They become cause and effect. Food becomes endurance. Power becomes tempo. Maintenance becomes safety. And quiet, repetitive work becomes air power you can see. We've walked through a $13 billion floating city in under 40 minutes. And we've only scratched the surface of each room and job you saw. It's easy to fall in love with the technology. Catapults, reactors, radar, jets, the biggest numbers, the loudest moments. But the reason the city works is simpler. A smiling cook who starts work hours before most of the ship is awake. A tired technician who can spot a problem by sound. A corpsman who keeps the city confident. A watchstander in the CIC who turns the ocean into decisions. A deck crew member who trusts the system because they've built it together, day after day. On a ship this complex, hero moments are rarely dramatic. They're routine done perfectly. That's the hidden story of the Ford class. Not just what it can do in a crisis, but how it stays ready when nothing is happening and everything still matters. Because readiness is a lifestyle here. And this city doesn't get to pause. So if this episode gave you the map, the rest of the season fills in the rooms. This is what Inside the Carrier is here to do. To take you inside every job and every hidden space on a U.S. aircraft carrier, one episode at a time, until this floating city stops feeling like myth and starts feeling understandable. So keep that cutaway in your head. Because next, we're zooming into some of the smallest rooms on this giant ship, the ones where a handful of sailors launch and catch multi-million-dollar jets all day long. Tiny rooms, huge stakes. If they get it wrong, nothing else we've seen matters. If you want to meet the people inside those rooms and see how the system really works, subscribe and come back for episode 2. And until then, remember this, on a Ford-class carrier, the biggest power isn't the steel. It's the coordination that makes a city move, fight, and come home.